Great. I think we're finally ready to start. Welcome. I'm Bob Balder. I'm the Executive Director here at Cornell AAP NYC. And we're excited to be able to have our infrequent but hopefully more annual Goldsmith Lecture. And we're excited this evening. And to kick things off, I want to share with you, you may have heard the Living Land acknowledgement for the Cornell community in Ithaca, but we also have one here in New York City. The Gensler Family AAP NYC Center is located on the unceded homelands of the Lenape people. We offer this acknowledgement in recognition of the original people of this land, the Lenape, their resilience in the face of settler colonialism, and their deep connection to this place. The land that the Lenape occupied before the arrival of European settlers is known as Lenape-Hoking, land of the people, an area including all of New York City and extending from western Connecticut to eastern Pennsylvania and from the Hudson Valley to New Jersey and to Delaware. Lenape nations, communities, and individuals live in locations spanning the world, including 5 federally recognized nations in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario, Canada. We acknowledge the painful history of Lenape dispossession and attempt of erasure, and honor the continuous connection of the Lenape people, past, present, and future, to these lands and waters. So this evening I get the honor of being able to welcome Mi-Jin Yoon, who is our Gail and Ira Ducker Dean of the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, and also the co-founder of Howler and Yoon. She's an architect. Oh, I'm going to be quick. Howler and Yoon, and of course, Mi-Jin's no stranger to this group, and we're really excited to have you back here in New York City. Her travels take her far and wide, but really great to have you with us this evening. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning's annual L. Michael Goldsmith Lecture, tonight with architect educator Kim Yao. I'd like to thank our hosts at the Gensler Family AAP New York City Center, and before I introduce Kim, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the Goldsmith family and to Michael's colleagues and friends who are here tonight, who understand as much or more than anyone his deep appreciation for his Cornell education, his lifelong passion for architecture, and love of the profession. We're here tonight in memory of Michael, and thanks to his family's generosity, which makes it possible for us to bring leaders in the field of architecture to share their work and impact on the built environment with us. Kim Yao is unquestionably one of those leaders. She joins us this evening from the Brooklyn-based Studio Architecture Research Office. She joined ARO after finishing her graduate degree in 1997. 27 years later, she is co-principal and has been critical to the evolution of the practice, realizing projects large and small. She's received numerous awards and has recently served as the president of the New York AIA in 2020. Her extraordinarily commitment to the profession and paying it forward is greatly admired. She serves on the board of the Center for Architecture and has spent years of engaged mentorship and teaching of the next generation of architects at GSAP, the School of Constructed Environments, Parsons, and Barnard College. And why not Cornell? Architecture Research Office is known both for its design research and design excellence. Their award-winning projects range from schools to cultural institutions, to acoustic systems, to public structures, each revealing how design might more thoughtfully and surprisingly balance considerations of scale and use with formal innovation and material quality. Kim's widely recognized work has helped shape not only the built environment in immediate and tangible ways, but also how designers today are reshaping practice with information, clarity, care, and intention in a people-focused manner. ARO's grounded and holistic approach spans sites and scales and distinguishes their practice include university buildings, primary schools, an ongoing partnership with Knoll and the DIA Foundation, and the creation and revival of really extraordinary, intimate, and inspired spaces of prolific artists such as Donald Judd and Mark Rothko. Despite these distinct and particular conditions, Kim's and ARO's work remains constant. Each project is extraordinarily well considered from start to finish, from concept to detail, immaculately and robustly articulated, always the perfect amount of design and the perfect amount of restraint. At a time when the architecture discipline faces critical questions about our responsibility to people, the natural environment, the future of cities and communities, there are few better to answer, though we don't expect all the answers tonight, than Kim. Kim's practice as a designer and educator sustains a deeply human, productive connection to the built and natural environment. And we are so excited to have you here this evening. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to, you're going to see behind the wheels here for a moment, I think, while I exit this, if I can. Yep, sorry. And go to the presentation. Okay, ta-da. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for joining me here tonight, all of us here tonight. I'm so excited to spend a little bit of time together. Thank you to the Goldsmith family for making this possible and giving us all a really good excuse to kind of come together and think a little bit about architecture and what was important to your family. Thank you to Cornell AAP, and thank you, Meechin, for that gorgeous introduction. I'm gonna have to ask you for the text because that was so nice. I hope we can do all those wonderful things in the time that we have together. And I know the plan is to have some Q&A at the end, and so we'll put my phone out so I can keep track so that we have plenty of time to do that. So Brooklyn-based, we are Brooklyn-based. I'm part of Architecture Research Office. I have two great partners and an amazing studio, about 40 people who work together very collaboratively. That's part of our ethos, and I'll talk a lot about that tonight. But our work is founded in just a belief in sort of engaging many different types and scales of problems. And so for us, and Meechin summarized this very well, that could mean like a boathouse right here on the Brooklyn waterfront, or a boathouse upstate on the kind of rural waterfront on the Hudson River. Might mean a small little passive house project up in Syracuse, or a very large-scale passive house project in downtown Brooklyn, which is a school that's just opened its doors a couple weeks ago to the New York City public school students. A little house for a family in the California Rockies, or a beautiful house for a couple who wants to age in place in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So this range of scale and typology is really important to us. Small building for math at Brown University, or a really big muscular building for football at University of Cincinnati. So that was like our first stadium, and hopefully not our last, but it was a lot of fun to work on that. And spaces that really help welcome people and orient them to place, which is really important for us. So something like this welcome house at Rothko Chapel in Houston, or this little welcome pavilion or Frederick Church Center up in Hudson at Olana, which is just finishing construction and will be opening and ribbon cutting later this fall. So these moments that really help orient people and welcome them to place and to connect them to each other and to the landscape. There are a few themes in our work, so I like to kind of start like this to orient both myself and everybody else, but one of those themes is that we really believe in the power of strategic thinking and the importance of thoughtfulness and intelligence in bringing that to our design work. So that could be at the scale of an interior space or a company or a building, or at the scale of a campus or a city. So thinking sort of strategically about how we use material resources and how they impact the built environment. And it also has to do with, fundamentally for us, a joy of making and the kind of craft and creativity that goes into innovating with materials and thinking about architecture and tectonics. Those are really important foundational tenets in our practice. But the other thing that I started off by talking about was collaboration. Like, we have this great studio of people that I am so fortunate to work with, and our work together builds a broader team of collaborators with other designers, other consultants, and of course with clients who are our most important thought partners. And I talk about collaboration because collaboration for us is a very, very important vehicle for the research part of our practice. Like, how we engage in research and applied research sometimes has to do with things that we're really interested in, but often has to do with issues and ideas that we can expand and grow and learn about through the collaborations that we have. So that might be something like this glass-supported stair that we did with Guy Nordenson, who's a structural engineer, or creating a concrete wall that's acoustic, a project that we did with Threshold Acoustics, who are based in Chicago, or collaborating every day on sites with craftspeople and makers and builders to really elevate the work that we're doing, like this bricklayer for this Botanic Garden building that's in Brooklyn. The big piece of collaboration is listening. And so for us, that listening has to do with engagement, how we can meet a client or that thought partner, understand what their goals are, and try to achieve those goals through the work that we're doing, in the built environment. And that engagement might be in person, might be hybrid, but it might also involve larger communities and publics and people that we're serving through the work that we're doing. And so those processes are really important to us. This is our process, but it really is about creating this foundation where you analyze a problem, investigate all of the sort of conditions, the kind of context for that project or that problem, iterate and develop and kind of test different ideas, and ultimately synthesize in a way that kind of creates a foundation for what we think can be great design. So before any sketching and design ideation is happening, we're just having a conversation and trying to embrace a dialogue. How that sort of takes shape is through establishing project principles. I'm going to talk a lot about principles tonight in different ways, but principles for us are a vehicle for aligning with our clients or our users around a set of goals that we can use as a touchstone in the work. And so these were the principles for Rothko Chapel. We're doing multiple phases of work with Rothko Chapel, but the idea was to say, what are these goals that we can be targeting through the work? And they're really important because when you get into these pressure points later in projects and processes, we could go back to those principles as a sort of touchstone for if we were making good decisions. And we could remind our whole community or our whole team, hey, we're making these choices because we all agreed that these were the goals that we were kind of working towards through the project. So that's how we approach projects. This talk, for me, is an opportunity to share a little bit about something new for us, which is we just are publishing a book. We're literally, it's like out next week. It's just launching, and this is the cover. And the book for us was an excuse for us to really reflect on our practice. We had our 30th anniversary last year. We spend a lot of time being contemplative about what we do and reflecting on how we're doing it and actually trying to make those processes better, actively, strategically, thoughtfully, both in terms of our community, but in terms of then the people we interact with and the sort of other younger architects and designers that we engage with. So as part of the book, we established another set of principles for ourselves, which was really a way of identifying our value set, which is an undercurrent in all our work, like in that introduction I just gave about like the overview of ARO. But the value set is something that we hadn't really specifically ever articulated for ourselves in terms of what matters to us in our projects. And so I'm going to structure the lecture today, go through a handful of projects, and talk about them as case studies for these principles or these values. It's a little bit simplistic because we sort of have buckets of different principles, and then I'll say, okay, I'm going to talk about one project around a principle, but the reality, as we all know as designers and architects or people who experience the built environment, all of these things are interconnected. And so for us, it's just a vehicle for sort of articulating what's important to us in practice, and actually to focus on the practice itself as part of the book rather than just the work, which is something that is kind of something that we care a lot about, is really shaping the practice. And so the first principle is strategize for maximum impact. I already talked about strategic thinking, but the point here for us is to be careful, to go through that process at the outset, to align around those principles, but to really try to achieve the most with the most efficient and thoughtful use of resources being time, people, energy, material, so that we can kind of create architecture that is impactful in the long term, and transformational, like as it opens and occurs. And so the first project I'm going to talk about relative to this principle is a new urban ground, and many of you or some of you might be familiar with some of this work, but a new urban ground is a collaboration that we actually a long-term collaboration in many different forms. So initially, my partner Adam Urinsky and Guy Nordenson and Catherine Sievett worked on base research on rising water levels in the Palisades Bay in the harbor. And that research informed a show that Barry Bergdahl curated at the Museum of Modern Art called Rising Currents. Our particular, sorry, I'm just trying to move forward. Our particular project for that show was called, there we go, sorry, A New Urban Ground. We were at Site Zero. So for the intention behind this exhibit was to basically give different architectural teams different sites around the harbor, and everyone would kind of explore those sites with new modes of infrastructure, imagining a future where our water levels are significantly higher than they are today. And obviously this is a future that we are all experiencing in different ways. Our site was at Site Zero, so we collaborated, and you're going to hear me talk a lot about collaboration tonight. We collaborated with Susanna Drake of D-Land Studio, who's a landscape architect, to really imagine a new infrastructural system that would rethink a hard edge, the hard edge of the city, and soften that edge in order to handle water and manage water more effectively. The intent here, and what you're seeing across these three sides, was to do several things. So you'll also hear this theme about how can we do the most with the moves that we're making. We wanted to address a serious issue in New York City, which is just sewage and our combined sewer system. So when we have major storm events or major heavy rainfall, we have raw sewage that goes out into the waterways. Rising water levels due to temperature. So obviously, many of us know this, that our water levels are going up and encroaching on our land, which is what you're seeing here in the center. And then lastly, storm surge. So in a storm surge, future storm surge event, in another 100 years, 60% of lower Manhattan could be inundated with water, right? So we would be inundated where we're standing. I live a couple blocks away, actually, we would be inundated. So the intent here is to say, how could we rethink these old engineering systems and come up with a new vision for an ecological infrastructure that actually gives back to the city through parkland, through estuary, promotes wildlife. This is a cross-section through lower Manhattan, so estuaries, from estuaries to marshes, so that the infrastructure is actually giving back to the community and supporting life in this place. The idea here was to really take hard infrastructure and put it in vaults so that it was protected, so electrical systems, et cetera, and create these arteries of soft infrastructure that absorbed water and held the water to release it slowly back into the waterways. So again, kind of controlling that outflow, which is a major challenge in storm events. Creating park at the same time and promoting access, sort of species, and really recreation and an appreciation for our relationship to the water. And all of that work kind of underpinning over many years post that show, research that we continued to do in the face of challenges that we've had in Lower Manhattan and the rest of New York City with Superstorm Sandy and ongoing kind of stabilization projects that are happening now. We haven't worked on this for a number of years, but post Sandy, we did work with the Department of City Planning to think about like sort of retreat scenarios in impacted areas due to water. Approaching architecture as a social act. So the concept with this principle is to really think about what we do in the process of creating architecture is social, how we engage. When I talked about engagement earlier, communities, users, faculty, teachers, residents, and places, all of that process of design is social, how we think about a design team and bring the best people we can to collaborate with, both in our office and then to the broader team. All of that is part of this act. And so for this project, I wanted to talk about a school building that we did up at the Riverdale Country School, which is in the Riverdale neighborhood of the Bronx. And this project was rooted in a deep level of engagement with their community, both with the administration, but teachers, staff, students of all ages, to really understand the special place that they had on their campus. This is a campus that serves pre-K through fifth graders before they go to a different campus for middle school and high school. And so their vision is one that's very much about teaching students where, their place in the world, how they understand who they are and grow with a connection to the environment. It's also a campus that's indoor-outdoor, so students are going in and out of buildings all the time to switch classes, much like you would if you were an older student on a different kind of campus. And one of the things that really emerged from all of these conversations, first we looked at saving a building, which we were not able to save it. We tried to do that first because it was such an unusual building. You couldn't even walk from like one end to the other without going outside or going through the library. You couldn't go from classroom to classroom. And all the classrooms were different sizes. So one of the first things we did through conversation with that community and through conversation with those teachers was reorganize the whole campus so that we could cluster classes together that were of the same age. So our building really served ultimately third, fourth, and fifth graders with classrooms that were like, ta-da, all the same size. Like it seems really obvious, but that wasn't the case for them before. And classrooms that were of a proportion that supported the way they teach on that campus, which is a co-teaching model. The other thing that sort of influenced the building was this notion of how they gather and use space. So flexibility was really, really important, but thinking that there are scales of space and scales of gathering that should be able to be transformed and used in many, many different ways. And so the building is anchored by a theater and by a student center. This is the theater on one end, and this is the student center on the other, but all of these spaces had to function in multiple ways for events, dinners, programming, play, everything you could imagine that can happen in a school should be happening in these spaces. And that scale of gathering would then break down into the commons, which is this corridor access through the center that was marked by the stairs on either end and skylights. And the idea of the commons was really to promote students to break out from the classroom and gather, work collaboratively in small groups or pairs. The teachers, since they co-teach, break into class into half and they break into separate areas. So everything was sort of a scaled unit so that the students could continue to learn and share together. Every surface in the building also had to be performative or functional surfaces. And so this is just a sort of, here this is this view out to the river through the windows, but there's storage, there's writable walls, there's display walls. The classrooms break out into the landscape so that they can co-teach outside. So everything has an exterior space that's shared by those classrooms. And then the hallway has that same notion of functional performative surfaces. So just painted homosote, which is like what you see to pin up in studio, but basically so that the students' work could be on display and that students could gather in these breakout areas to collaborate and to sort of share and to display their work. Under each of these, in each of these areas were skylights. So we introduced skylights as teaching moments to really animate the anchors of that commons and animate those breakout spaces in the center. And the skylights became these opportunities to connect to the curriculum and have like a teaching moment. So maybe it's a sundial, or maybe it's a way to think about color and light. Maybe it's a way to orient to the cardinal directions. And so all of the skylights had these moments with teaching text, so that the students could kind of understand what was happening, and it let each skylight be different across the course of the hallway. So you can kind of see these moments here. It's always great to have photos with kids in them, often. And then one of the last things I want to say, we collaborated with Open on this project, who's a graphic designer. And here you can see on the top left this notion of kind of directional signage, so the kids could be like, oh, Sport Dival's there, or like Tokyo is there. And some of that signage had to do with understanding the systems in the building. But the other thing that we did, which was really wonderful, is we celebrated the students. So instead of having like a donor wall, and donors are important, donors are great, but instead of having a donor wall, we had a student wall. And so the idea is when you entered this building, you got your name on a plaque, and that went on the wall, and the wall would reorganize every year, and this still happens. And then when you graduate, when you graduate from 5th grade and you go up to the Hill campus, which is for older students, you get to take your name with you. So this really lovely moment of kind of connecting the students and letting them feel like this was their place. We believe in engaging the complexity of context. Those contexts could be social, cultural, historical, relational. How do we think about place and meaning through the work that we're creating? And so this is very foundational, in our work, and I'm sure in many of the architects and designers in this room, that's an important idea, but it stems from this notion of that engagement again, us not coming to the table and saying, hey, I've got this like great idea for a house, and this is what it's gonna look like. Like, we wanna say, what do you want your house to be? What do you wanna have in it? How do you wanna gather? How do you wanna live? And then come up with an idea that is more about you than it is about us, and that's really important in our work, even though there are threads of continuity that you can kind of, I think, see in looking at the project. So this is a project that's under construction right now. It's at Greenwood Cemetery, which is in Sunset Park, and the context here is really fascinating. The cemetery is a beautiful, one of the first kind of rural cemeteries created in the country. Gorgeous place if you've never been there. Almost 500 acres tucked in Brooklyn of beautiful hills and landscape trees, and of course monuments and spaces for reflection and spaces for worship. And the challenge and interesting thing about this project is that our site was actually outside the cemetery gates. And so one of the really interesting things about Greenwood is they're an active cemetery, and they're shifting, but simultaneously they're shifting their mission to support ongoing, like a longer-term future of community engagement and kind of cultural place. So they have arts programming, bird watching, you can go and learn about conservation. They have all of this educational programming because they know their timeline is long, but they know there's a point where they will run out of space and they will no longer be an active cemetery. So they are really shifting into more of a cultural organization or institution. And so the connection to the place is really important, but our building's role was to really welcome people and orient them to Greenwood, but to do that outside of the gate, outside of the cemetery proper. And so this is sort of just situating you. You can see Sunset Park, you can see most of the cemetery there in the plan. And then as you go up the drive through the gate to the cemetery, there are these beautiful arches that are the Richardson arches that are gorgeous and historic, and normally that's the threshold, like that's when you know you've arrived. On the opposite corner is this little historic greenhouse, which Greenwood had purchased. It was never owned and operated by the cemetery, so the greenhouse, adjacent to it there was a monument house. Those were buildings that basically were adjacent program and businesses that supported people who were coming to the cemetery. So you would stop at the greenhouse and buy your flowers, you would go to the monument house and order or choose a monument. And so this industry existed because of the cemetery's adjacency, but the greenhouse is this beautiful historic building that Greenwood wanted to save. And so our site is adjacent to that building. They actually worked with a restoration architect for the initial preservation of the greenhouse, and our building basically hugs the greenhouse and orients up the hill towards the cemetery. So you can see the gate of the cemetery there. You can see the Weir greenhouse in the corner, and then Sharon's house, which is the one with the structure. Sharon lives there, and her when everything got removed, there's a lot of shoring to hold her building up, and there's very careful construction happening, so her building continues to stand. But we basically have this sort of demarcate the space around the greenhouse. The other important thing about this is that rectangle you're seeing in the plan is our landmarks designation. So the greenhouse is landmarked, and everything we do outside of that box can be whatever we want it to be, but however we're touching the greenhouse has to be still approved by landmarks. And those of you who work with landmarks sort of understand some of this complexity. So we're sort of demarcating and orienting towards the cemetery, and then installing the single-story building that aligns with the greenhouse so it's nice and low. That's an education building and lobby, and then a larger kind of gallery, exhibit, and administrative building on the backside of that L, so that we kind of hug the greenhouse and capture landscape into this place also, working with Michael van Valkenburg, landscape architects, or MVVA, who sort of imagined this green as an extension of the cemetery into the courtyard, which is what you're seeing there, is that gap between our new building and the greenhouse as you enter. All of this sort of looks up towards the arches and towards the hill. So the goal of us from a massing standpoint was that you could be inside, look out into the courtyard, look over the greenhouse, and then see the arches and see the cemetery. This is the building there on 5th Avenue and 25th Street. So the context for us is both about the history of this place, but it's about the arches. Like, the arches and the green are what connect people to the cemetery. So we really wanted to think about a material that resonated with those arches, and so and felt handmade, felt crafted in the way that those arches feel crafted. And so we landed on working with terracotta and doing a custom terracotta rain screen in this sort of beautiful eggplant purpley color that sort of resonates with what you see in the arches. So these are just photos from a couple weeks ago. It's my partner Stephen in Germany, like looking at modules from the rain screen. Those terracotta pieces are arriving on site in the next week or so, and they really define the building. Some places solid and other places perforated, so you can see out of the glass and again get that great view. So this is that entry courtyard. We're in that landmarks zone, but basically between the greenhouse, our building is meant to be deferential to the greenhouse and to connect to the arches and to the cemetery. The ground floor has that entry space, gallery spaces, lobby, classroom, and education, and then the greenhouse is going to be used for multi-purpose reasons by the cemetery. They'll have programming, interpretive content, exhibits. They can have events in there if they want to. This is the gallery space, and you can see how you can look through the courtyard and see the greenhouse itself, which is really, really beautiful. This is the inside of the greenhouse just a couple weeks ago. We're doing like an air floor, so we're like lifting the floor and doing all the systems at the base, so all the HVAC will come out of the floor so that you're kind of seeing that infrastructure going in, and they just started breaking through the brick wall there in the back to connect to the rest of our building. On the upper floor, there's administrative spaces, and then actually you can see here at the bottom, there's going to be a green roof. So the sculpted landscape on the roof, so that when you're up in those offices and having meetings, you look out across that roof and you'll see the cemetery itself. So these connections were really important to us to kind of stitch these places together, and they feel like they're coming together when we visit the site during construction. We believe in elevating the ordinary. This has to do with what I was talking about earlier when I said we love like materials and making and kind of all of that pattern and surface and thinking about experiencing materials in different ways. And so for us, this is also a place where we feel like a lot of our research occurs. Sometimes that research is happening at the scale of the city, like the first project I shared, but other times it's happening in product development or thinking about new systems, which is what I wanted to talk about here. Meejin talked about acoustics, and acoustics are really important to us, but our work on the ARO collection, which is a collection of modular acoustic materials that can be specified by architects worldwide, really stemmed from an initial collaboration with Knoll in creating their New York City offices and showroom. We worked with Knoll for about over a decade on spaces around the country, and when we started working with them, they said, we have this amazing, at the time it was new, this amazing new line of like felt and leather, and we'd love to make sure it has a place in the design of the space. And we said, well, let's use that felt and leather and use it as architectural finish and create stairs with it, create rooms with it, so that people can really, architects and specifiers who are coming into that showroom can understand how they can utilize the product. So it was really about selling, but it was also about beauty and warmth and materiality. And as an outgrowth of that, Roger Wall, who is the vice president who runs Spinnebeck Filzfelt, which is this subsidiary that has the felt and the leather, said, you know, we should turn that into a product. Let's take this wall paneling. It's beautiful. The rooms are really acoustically private and very warm. And let's turn it into a product because people are asking for things like this. And the amazing thing is, of course, that's even more important to us now in the past few years where we're doing all our phone calls and doing everything in all these different spaces. The acoustic environment we're within is critically important to kind of our health, but also our productivity in many ways. So this is kind of a little matrix that just shows some of the applications for the product. The concept of the product is that it's modular, you can specify it easily, and we approached it, Roger really liked that we're architects, and he's like, you're gonna understand how other people wanna come and specify the product, because that's what you do. And so the fact that we weren't product designers didn't matter to him, because we approached it from our vantage point of what do you need to know, and how do I wanna be able to work with something to customize it enough for my project or my client. So the process has been really rewarding. I'm just showing some of the iteration that we do in our work. We do a lot of work digitally and a lot of analog work still, a lot of physical model making and mock-ups. So this is like ceiling product or grid, which was one of our latest products that we released. We basically, over the years, do R&D on the product while we're working on projects with Knoll, or have been historically. Knoll has since merged with Herman Miller, and it's now Miller Knoll, so we're not doing these projects anymore, but we are still launching product. And so you're seeing here the kind of efforts of that, like us mocking stuff up. We'll send ideas to them. They're fabricating those pieces, sending them back to us. Sometimes we travel. A lot of this product is actually fabricated in Buffalo and New Hampshire, and there's been this sort of boom in the manufacturing part of this, but one of the things that's really interesting is that we kind of are going hand in hand. So we're developing and we're working with, keeping in mind the tools that they have at the time, and then they keep adding equipment, and so we keep sort of expanding what's possible through this ongoing collaboration. As part of that process, here we are very early on doing acoustic testing. This we also did with Threshold, but we work with Spinnebeck Filzfelt on thinking about how you have to put all the material together, how you make it, again, specifiable, what that data is like, so that it's actually a product that people can go out and purchase. And so there's some installations, versions of plank and shingle, all of these screens and things that we've done over time. Block was all about using remnant fabric so that we had less waste in the process, and it has a lower price point. Baffle. So of course, as architects, we want to like touch everything, and we have a lot of ideas, and then we kind of share with Roger, and he's like, that is a good idea, or he'll say, no one's going to buy that, or we can't make it. And so it's just like really, really nice ongoing conversation, and it's very rewarding for us because now we get to specify the product in other projects that we're doing and actually utilize it in other spaces beyond just in our own office or on our own drawing board. So these are some examples of those installations, and some of these are more custom that you can't actually specify, but we still actually get to talk to him about making them, and then he says it's too hard or it'll be too expensive, so no one's going to buy it. So we believe in designing for use and experience, and this is fundamental, we think, for great architecture, but some of those qualities of materiality, surface, pattern are really about how we experience space over time, over the course of a day, over the course of the year in different seasons, and that notion that space is always being transformed through its usage and experience is something that's important to us and that we spend a lot of time thinking about. So the example I wanted to use for this is Dia Chelsea, and Dia Chelsea is a project that we did with the Dia Foundation. Dia has sites all over, and one of the things that they're known for is really having site-specific art installations that last for a very long time. So sometimes, something like the Lightning Field or the Earth Room in Soho, those are projects that Dia sort of stewards those spaces and that work so that people can experience it forever. Dia was in Chelsea, had space in Chelsea before Chelsea became the artist neighborhood that it is today. And we started talking to them about how they could expand their public-facing program in Chelsea. They had these low warehouse spaces, which were really amazing, but you couldn't go into them from like the inside. You had to go in and out from the sidewalk to go from one gallery to the next because there was no interconnectivity, even though they owned all three of these structures. And so our conversation with them really stemmed from wanting to embrace the existing architecture of the warehouses. For them, that's also something that's very, if you've been to any of their spaces, other spaces or this space, is really important to them, is basically taking that fabric and using that historic fabric to shape the environment and then have the artist's work respond to that environment. So we basically started a dialogue with Dia and with Jessica Morgan, who's the executive director, about how to reimagine Dia's presence and recreate the experience of those warehouses while leaving all of the fabric intact to the best of our ability. And so what you can see here is a transformation. We had to do a new street wall on those low buildings because of the deterioration within the existing brick, and because we were humidifying and doing all of this work at the interior. And also functionally, they needed these very large openings. And so the concept here is that you enter now on the right, there's lobby space, a bookshop, there's a talk space. So for them, this was both about expanding public-facing program and also enabling the experience of art in a more fluid way. Now people can arrive and actually enter and go through all of the spaces. They're humidified. It can support different types of work than it could have support before. So here you're seeing these two galleries. I call one is sort of dark and the other light. The dark one has this great, huge bifolding door, and it's opaque and solid, and the other gallery has these beautiful telescoping glass doors, these large openings to the street that basically they can pull art in and out from, and they can open up and connect to the street if they choose to. And then all of them kind of in succession. When you enter now through the lobby, one of the other things that happened at the same time is Dia went back to a no-pay model. There was a period you never had to pay to go to Dia. And then there was a period where you started to have to pay like you would a museum, but are now endowed in a way where you can go for free and experience the art. So this is all connected. The spaces, having more public-facing program, having the bookstore, creating the talk space, which is both a space for programming, education, but also art, installation, performance pieces, media pieces. So this is this large gathering space in the back. And by creating this talk space, we were able to open up their upper floors and create a library and education space that's separately programmed. So it allows them to have more room to experience, for people to experience and engage with their artists and with art in general. And then kind of having this really simple idea of like an opening, so you could go from one building to the next or one gallery to the next. These are all separate addresses by staying inside rather than having to go out to the street. And so you never could do that before. So very simple. You can see these openings in these thick party walls between the different warehouse structures that we created. The other really cool thing about this project is that each of these buildings has totally different, well, they were all different addresses, all different infrastructure, also completely different structural systems. And because Dia wants to embrace that existing fabric again, so that, much like we have in this great space, like so people can experience it and the artists can respond to it, we kind of revealed everything and using some degree of restraint to show, to sort of show off the bones and the character of each of these existing buildings and to really celebrate the architecture that was there. And so as you enter, this is this view going to the west. You can see one opening and in the distance another opening, and the fact that you can walk straight through was really important. But Jessica was very, very opinionated about where openings happened, not too close to the corner. We always had to have corners complete, and had this really lovely idea that you shouldn't be able to see directly from one to the next, and that there should be this little offset. So you're seeing, and here we're looking to the next gallery, but you can see here that there's this little glimpse of light in that gallery that has a big glass opening. So you go through that in-between space between the two buildings, between those old, thick masonry structural walls, and you have to sort of jog to go into the next gallery, and you can kind of see that moment here. And then what you're also seeing is that basically one of the galleries has all that brick exposed, and the other one, it's painted, and then Dia transforms these spaces in collaboration with the artists who install there. All of the systems, all of the HVAC, all of the humidification is like this sort of monster on the roof, this octopus on the roof, so that you're not experiencing that when you're in the warehouse or in the gallery itself. And we sort of replaced all the skylights, added more skylights so that, again, access to light and the passage of time is one of the reasons you go back. You go into these spaces and experience the art. And it's different when you go in the morning and go in the afternoon. It's different if you go in the fall versus the spring. And that's one of the reasons it's really nice to go back again and again. So here we're going back in, and I just wanted to share a few views of some of the installations. This is Lucy Raven. This was the first installation when the galleries opened. And you can see this space has this beautiful wood truss. The next gallery over, that first one actually has steel and concrete plank, so very different structural systems. This is Normant. She did sound, often sound work, so this was a different installation, and this is her work also in that wood truss gallery. So very, very different installations that people can experience when they return to Dia again and again. This is Darcy Morellis. This actually just came down recently. This is really cool. And so we love it because we get to go back and experience the spaces over and over as well. We believe in working with integrity, which for us means with honesty, to meet people where they are and their kind of goals and visions for what they want to achieve, and to, again, try to maximize the impact with the project. Like our resources, everybody's resources are limited. Obviously, our world's resources are limited, but how you can do as much as possible with the moves you're making is something that's really important to our kind of problem-solving skills, which we think of as being kind of very New York-driven thing. We always go to places and say, we're New York City architects, because we're used to trying to do as much as possible in a tiny space. So it really, in a complex way sometimes, in complex contexts, so it's something that informs our work. So this is a project we did that just finished about a year ago for the University of Washington in Tacoma, which is a city that's kind of in between Seattle and Portland, if anybody here is from the Northwest, like me. I'm from the Northwest. And it is an urban serving campus, largely commuter campus, a lot of first-generation students, urban and historic. So here you can see on the right these beautiful old historic warehouse buildings that the university has adaptively reused as academic buildings. Our building is the one in the middle there. But here are some views of that historic place. So the integrity here for us, the idea of that for this project to me is that this was a project that had really, really big ambitions. They needed to be in a landmarked area. They wanted to bring together new programming. This is a view of like the historic Prairie Line Trail, which is this landscaped access through the campus that becomes a new kind of artery that we were supposed to kind of connect to. They wanted it to be a gateway to this edge of the campus. It needed to also be a hub of activity so students would come here. It's also a project that was serving an interdisciplinary group of users, all very different with very, very different and often competing goals. And those users, which were the School of Engineering, the Milgard School of Business, so the business school, and the Global Innovation Design Lab, which was like a design thinking, kind of interdisciplinary design thinking space. All of these people do a ton of work with the communities, so this is also about bringing community partners into the building. And then there's administration who are like, we just need big classrooms. So there's all this stuff, and everybody is equally important, but their space needs are radically different, and their budgetary needs associated with those space needs are radically different. So having to kind of balance the goals and ambitions of all of these different users was very, very important so that everyone would be happy in the end, or would be loved in the end, love the building in the end. And then celebrating timber. This is a place in a town that was a paper town, all about timber. And so from the outset, the chancellor said, and got permission, funding for this project by saying, I'm going to make it a timber project. And what we had to do in this process was protect the timber, or the mass timber, which is a structural system for the building, defensively throughout, because it at the outset appears like it might be more expensive than other more typical steel and concrete structural systems. So we worked on this project as a design build project. We worked with Anderson Construction. So the other part of this, again, coming back to collaboration, was learning from them. They're a Northwest-based builder. They do mass timber buildings all the time. And so we were able to really gain from their expertise, which was important in our process, and again, allowed us to create a bigger and better building than we probably wouldn't have been able to do without that collaboration. So here you can kind of see the diagram of the partee. The pink and the blue and the orange are about large, medium, and small spaces, which is also kind of an environmental strategy, it's a structural strategy, and it's a programmatic one. And then the connector that cuts through there is that connecting piece that brings community in, structural system with mass timber, and then a cladding system that's metal and brick. Again, we have landmarks district on one side and then kind of like future growth on the other. So the metal faces that future growth with a number of lab spaces. Prairie Line Trail is that green axis on the top, and then you can see this cut through. Number one is the connector, and that's that space that also provides accessibility on this end of campus. So the building is facilitating what is a really steep topographical change as you go up the hill. And here you can kind of see the big, the medium, and the small spaces. The labs are all mediums. Offices and various kind of smaller classrooms are smalls, and then the bigs were our large kind of format flexible classrooms. So the structural strategy is hybrid, and our steel and timber happen for those large span spaces that can't have columns, kind of like a space like this, but maybe twice as wide. And then we have glue lamp columns, beams, decking to kind of create the structure of the building. And at a very, very regular spacing, because it was efficient and it went up quickly. It's cost effective to do it that way. And so we were kind of working very tightly in collaboration with the team, and the KPFF was a structural engineer, to kind of achieve these spaces. So here you can see the metal skin. This is the lab side of the building. And then the brick has all of these really simple, regular windows, and those windows face the historic district and the historic warehouses. So this kind of dialogue between the brick and the metal was important. And here through that center, you can see the timber, and you enter through that connector, and you're greeted with this, we call it the timber story. So the chancellor, who got the funding for the project, was phenomenal. He's on faculty in the engineering department still, and he is also like a amateur historian. And he also led all of the conversations with the Puyallup tribe, who are the tribe who have been in this region for a very long time. So the university managed, and facilitated those conversations. But Mark's idea, or Mark Pagano's idea, was to kind of create a timber history so that people understood the importance of timber in this region and understood the importance of timber for this project. And so this, and to the Puyallup tribe. So this is sort of greets you when you enter the building, and then the connector space is defined by that timber, so everybody can really be aware of, and all the engineering students can be aware of how important the wood is and how it's performing in the building. This is the high impact practice space, so really large span. This is where we have hybrids, so steel structures spanning across here. You can see a little aero grid in the ceiling, and then lab spaces that are really kind of functional, simple, direct, honest, everything exposed in the building from a systems standpoint. And then this is a view of the building looking back across the Prairie Line Trail. So the last kind of principle I wanted to talk about is one that seems simple, but is probably the most important, which is always keep learning. And for us, the book was an excuse to kind of have that conversation about how we want to keep learning as a practice. And the practice part is also what we wanted to kind of focus on in the book, not just the projects. And of course, the projects are important to us, and they're important to our clients, and they're important to all the wonderful people who work on them. But for us, we really strongly believe that the office itself is our most important design project. The thing that we care the most about, that we steward most carefully, is the office and the people who make up that place. And what we want to do, the opportunities I wanted to have when I was fresh out of school or an intern in First Learning, are the opportunities I want to offer, or we want to kind of sort of steward, but there's still things I want to be able to do. Like, we want to keep learning, just like somebody 20 years younger than me wants to keep learning. And so we try to continually reflect and refine our strategies. The book was one vehicle for doing that. Some of those strategies have to do with how we're doing our analog and digital making, like, can we do things better? Can we do things more effectively? Is it a good idea for my partner Adam, to go sit and make models himself? Sometimes it is, but what are the things that we can still do, and what are the things that we rely on the talent in the office to help us execute because of our very diverse and varied skill set. So sometimes it's about research, like this project, which was with Boston Valley Terracotta, the Architectural Ceramics Assembly Workshop, which they do annually, so rethinking terracotta screens. But having fun making and executing on research and doing it together and supporting the office in the process. So we have many office-led initiatives that are important that the team has come to us and said, we want to have these conversations. So those range from like zero waste, social equity, artificial intelligence now, which hopefully somebody is figuring out something important, and for us and for our field, but having those conversations and making space and time for those conversations, and remembering to kind of, in our words or in our minds, like, train the whole architect and really allow people to understand the many facets of practice, so that they, if they don't choose to spend their whole careers at ARO, and we have many people who, like me, have been there for their whole careers and for a very long time, that they actually understand the notions and importance of how to kind of think about practice as they consider going off and starting their own. Mentorship is a really important part of that. So we have many, many mentorship initiatives that are internal in the office that happen with us, but many people across the team who mentor in these different spaces. So that we have that kind of giving back mentality that's part of our ethos, and also in that same way engaging in community service and ways to gather together to build our own culture to strengthen it, so that we can kind of listen to each other as we're doing the work that we're trying to execute for other people and other communities. It's a process that for us is important. The book was really an opportunity to step back and think about how we work and talk about that, and to set out the principles so we could project forward to how we want to continue working when we think about like our next 30 years of practice. And so it was sort of a vehicle for doing that, and a really important one, and we're really excited that it is about to hit bookshelves in the next week. Thank you. That was fun. That's a lot. I sometimes talk a little fast, but I know there's time for questions. I would love to take questions about anything if anybody feels like sharing a question. Bob, I think, has a mic so that we can get it all picked up, I think, for the recording. Yeah, is it working?
Can you guys hear it? Okay. How about now? Yeah. Got it. Okay. Questions? Usually, someone from the Jody?
I hope you have a good question.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I very much enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The one thing that hit me kind of early on and then throughout this is, as I told you earlier, I'm definitely not an architect, but you're talking about proper project management, program management, portfolio management, all that kind of stuff, but from an architectural perspective. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how much, I could just holler as usual, everybody can hear me then. How much do you, I assume I'm seeing that parallel correctly, is that the correct thing that you folks see too, that with engineering project management, construction project management, program management, and architecture project management, you're just seeing that all melding and following these principles? Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that when it, that's a great question. I think it is about melding. I mean, I think one of the challenges that, we face as a profession is that, and as just a person, as people, is that everything is like harder and more complicated and requires higher and more specialized areas of expertise. And we're generalists. Like, we want to design, like chairs. And Adam just came out with a table. You know, like we want to do, you know, simple things. Of course, some people say architects think they can design everything, which is a problem because we can't, right? But, and we like to recognize that our best work comes through collaboration and it emerges from collaboration. So what you're talking about is definitely how we engage those collaborators and have a really productive environment for discourse to push design forward. So the principles are a vehicle to manage that process. It's a really good way of putting it. And to help remind us of what we set out to do, because it's really easy, and I think we all know this, all the designers and architects in the room know that you can get really caught up in the moment of whatever you are ruminating on. The principles are there to help like back out and look at the big picture again and think about what's really important in the project, because every project has different types of sacrifices. Every decision, you know, that you make is for one thing or the other. So it's a way to kind of structure that and also help expand our language as architects and designers to people who don't have that background and skill set. So the principles help articulate design aspirations in a way that is, we hope and think, more accessible, because we don't just like throw them out there. Like we really talk through them. They get wordsmithed by committees and groups. Like it's a whole process, but it helps people understand what we're trying to achieve, even though the way our tools are different than ones that they might use like on a daily basis.
Another question?
If you make eye contact with Bob, he's going to bring you the mic.
Hello, can you hear me? I have a kind of a specific question. There was one of the facade elements was from Boston Valley, and then the Greenwood Cemetery had a German product. Can you speak about the differences between the two?
Yeah, very good question. So, so we did Greenwood, many projects, not necessarily private or commercial ones or homes, but many projects that are for nonprofits or cultural institutions, even campuses or schools, occur over a very long period of time. And in developing and working on Greenwood and thinking about all the terracotta, we were talking to different terracotta manufacturers to understand what was possible. We also worked with Heinches on the facade for Greenwood. They're a great kind of facade consultant. They do the structural engineering. And so we brought them to the team at one point when we knew we were going to be engaging in terracotta, and it was something that we had less familiarity with. Sometimes what we do in the office is also say we'd love to work with X because we haven't done it yet. So sometimes there's a little thing about firsts, because you're seeing we also like to do first. So Boston Valley was really great, really responsive. We had great conversations with them. The reason I talked about timeline is because a project, we would design a phase and it would go on hold for a period of time until there was more funding to design the next phase. So it's happened over a long period of time. Really excited that it's in construction. That it's where it is right now. It should be done next year. So when we actually, hire the construction manager and they went out to bid, they went to Boston Valley, they went to Shodan, they went to different terracotta manufacturers who they thought could do the right job, and they did that through subcontractors who were basically furnishing and installing the whole facade system, so the glazing, the mullions, all of that structure and the terracotta. And through that process, they ended up choosing Shodan to supply the material. Because of our conversations with Boston Valley from earlier on, we got engaged in that architectural ceramics assembly workshop, which was a research sort of program that they have that you can put forth an idea or a team, and then they kind of curate a handful of research projects every year, and you do all the R&D directly with them, and then you get to fabricate something out of terracotta. And so we did a rain screen, which was that green terracotta image that you saw. So that in the process, that the process evolves. And of course, when you switch, when we had the drawings and went out to bid, everything that we were showing in the drawings also had to be non-specific anyway, right? So that different bidders could potentially respond. So the design of the system working then with children ends up evolving a little bit with their input, or ended up evolving a little bit because of their equipment and how they manufacture.
Hello, I have one question. I believe your office put extensive amount of research for each project, which is very impressive. However, I assume every project has budget and time constraints. Do you particularly convince client to allocate amount of time for the research separately, or is there a particular minimum time expectation that you trying to achieve? Those are my question, because like public school project, that's going to have very tight budget and time constraints. How do you convince the client? How do you allocate minimum time for the research? That's my question.
That's a really great question, and we're constantly trying to figure out how to allocate more time to that part of the process. We do advocate for the importance of creating that foundation from the outset, and that foundation that I was talking about involves a research component. Obviously, when I talked earlier about these threads that I'm kind of putting them into these separate chapters as a way of talking about the projects and the principles, but it's all interconnected. And so we'll have research like the terracotta that goes from one project to another, or an idea about this is applied research, an idea about shading and screens that is sort of a longer thread in our work that might go from very different projects and kind of come and go from different projects. So sometimes you're pushing research that's very personal across multiple projects. Other times you're engaging in research that's very specific to the place and that client, right? So it's a combination. So we don't always win that conversation, but we do advocate for the importance of having the time to understand where we're working, to really engage the users and the community in the best possible way, and actually to design a process with the owner and the client that best reflects and supports the ambition of the project. And so it's not always perfect, but we try really hard to create that space. And we also do strategic work and planning work that is not about buildings at all, and then the research gets embedded there in a different way. Sometimes I talk about, and this was not the way that I formulated tonight's talk, but sometimes I lecture more specifically on like research and how you embed research in practice, which is hard when we're a business and we're trying to like run a business, but you also want to have the time and space for some of these other ideas. And sometimes that can happen through different types of opportunities, can happen through grants, can happen through partnerships where you realize there's a way to dedicate some resources to an activity, for the Knoll product now, we have a royalty stream, so that can help underwrite some of the research that we continue to do in that space. So there's also ways that you can take research that you're building on and bring it to a client, right? So that it's not all starting from scratch, even though so much effort goes into those first conversations of really getting to know place, understand goals, establish those principles, So there's no one size fits all strategy, but we do want to continue to have more and more time and be appropriately compensated as a business, again, for that effort, because it's a really important part of our design process.
So a couple of questions. So you've talked about design advocacy, advocating for the design, advocating for the client, and for the communities that you work with. How do you modulate between the outside voice, which is all of the input that you're getting in, and the inside voice, which is the architect or the designer, And how do you modulate between how much to take in and what to basically put out? And then following from that, how far is the point of departure from where a project starts to where a project ends up? Because what I found out is, as an architect or coming in with an architect's ego, often where the project ends up after listening is a lot richer than what we as designers could have conceived going into the process.
Yeah, very thoughtful questions. Thank you. Sometimes you have to stand, like you or we or whomever, we get hired for our expertise. We get hired for our knowledge, and we get hired for our design approach, right? So at the end of the day, that modulation, I think, happens. We think our best work emerges from that dialogue because our work is meaningful to us if we're having a robust dialogue. It helps us make choices and prioritize, because our firm and many architects, I think, like responding to constraint or responding to parameters. And so in a way, the conversation helps inform the process. But we also back out, and recognize that you're being hired and asked to work on a project because they want your expertise, they want your guidance, they want your intelligence. And so there are moments where you have to, or try to, push for choices that that align with what we're hearing, but may not, at the end of the day, you're not going to make every single person in a big community engagement process happy with what you're doing with the project. So it's a constant balancing act. Again, that's where the principles help, because we try to talk about, if we're trying to go in one direction and it's not all perfectly aligned, we can try to frame those choices through the principles. So it's one way that we do that. But we're also, as you're going through the design process, students might feel like this, if you're designing and you're meeting your critic, and then you're hearing something and they're telling you to do something, and you're like, I really don't think I want to do that, so I'm just going to keep doing this over here, and we're going to get them to understand what's important to me. And so there's a moment there where things hopefully come together, right, where we're studying things and we're hearing, and it's informing what we're doing, but we're also trying to execute on a context that might be one that they have less access to all the time. And by that, I just mean we're making many, many choices, what are the systems, what is the budget, what are the implications, how is it being delivered, what are the logistics and complexities of the project, that also inform things more than just what is the room, how many people will be in it, what are the walls made of, things like that. The projects are better with the input. So your question about, I hope that answered your first question, your question about how much different can things be. Often clients, this is also where the research and the piece at the beginning, those early phases where you're kind of getting to know each other and really learning. Sometimes great clients, really thoughtful, smart organizations and institutions will have they'll be this is the program, this is what we want, and we're going to do it here. And through this process, we're able to identify, yeah, maybe, but what about all of these things? Did you talk to these people? Maybe you don't need as much space, because then your tight budget will go further if we can make the project smaller, things so maybe we should do more with lighting and less with walls, kind of coming at the problem in different ways. And so a lot of that is just through that conversation, but we also sometimes through engagement are able to hear voices that weren't the voices making those initial decisions and saying this is what the program should be, but we can come back and say, actually, we had one of our first projects we did at Brown, it's a library, a student center in a library, and the librarians were like, they want us to be up here, but we need to be down here, and we're okay being having less space, because we need to be, with information services, we need to be embedded with the students. We don't need our own floor. We want to be right where the students are. So we completely reworked the diagram in that project. The project area got smaller, a little bit more money per square foot, tight budget, all of that, because of listening to what the librarians were saying, which was something that hadn't happened yet in that process. So those are the places, I think, where things can be meaningfully transformed through the dialogue. as a little example.
Okay. You sort of answered one of my questions, royalties, and so my question was, as a business, were you looking for new revenue streams, or and do you think, and firstly, and secondly, are more and more architecture firms, and I'm not an architect, so that's why I'm asking it, are they following this trend, or are they sharing in this trend and looking for new ideas of ways to work with clients?
Thank you. I think that we're probably all always trying to find additional revenue streams because it's a challenge, right? Sometimes it's a challenge, but and also that desire or that impulse to design everything, which some of us have, that think that we can actually make it and do it better because it was our idea, is also there a little bit, even though I talk a lot about how important the collaboration is. So we had sometimes the research space and things that you're just making, since we spent a lot of time making and have historically done that just for our own interest in, again, surfaces, textures, porosity, screens. We often had this conversation, could we turn this into a product, not the architecture, the acoustic stuff, but other things. And it's not that easy. Anybody who's actually tried to do that, it's actually not that easy, although it's probably easier now than it was 30 years ago because there's more platforms for producing yourself and putting stuff out there, whether you're doing it through Etsy or doing it through some other platform. But doing it with a major manufacturer is not really that easy, and there are a lot of constraints. So we never really had anything stick, but we weren't thinking about it at all when this conversation emerged out of that project. And so it was very, very rewarding, but it also stemmed from the really amazing, from Roger, who's this amazing, smart person who is not a designer, but has design thinking in his blood, and also just is a business person. So he was the one who connected those dots. Now we're let's design other stuff. Yeah, so we have some other things that we are working on that I can't talk about, that are different spaces, not acoustics. But and it's fun, but it's also just nice because it's, one of the other things I talk about sometimes is that what we do as architects is really slow. Everything is you could spend your whole career and do 2-3 buildings, really, and our process is slow. Our learning opportunities are slow, and so depending on the kind of work you're doing. And so one of the really fun things about R&D and the kind of product development or that making space is you can make and experiment and create a lot more quickly than we can build buildings. And so that is very rewarding for us. But we're not phenomenal business people all the time, so we don't have the playbook on how to make this all happen. And fortunately, some of the things we're working on now are through connections where people saw what we were doing here and wanted to have a conversation about something in a different space. I do think architects are looking for different kinds of revenue streams, but I think it's just part of expanding modes of practice and different ways that we engage in practice. And there's so many talented firms and individuals who practice in different ways and kind of engage in their communities in different ways. So I do think that's very prevalent too.
This is more of a business question, which everybody seems to be touching on. I'm just curious. Between the pitching of an idea and then the drawings and then the reevaluation and then the construction starts at some point and pulling in all these people, the timeline on these things is just incredible. So is the key to a firm being able to go ahead and make money, to have multiple projects going on in different stages, different times? Because I don't understand how you could be successful, honestly.
No. Awesome question too, and I think we probably all need to need some more lessons in this space because again I am not a great business person, but you do have a lot of projects going on at the same time. So there's all kinds of challenges to that. I think that one of the things, one of the ideas in the book was really to kind of talk about, like, we originally talked about it as being like a primer of practice. Like, it's really a book about how to practice, you know, a way that we're practicing, but as a way of being maybe a resource for for people or designers or other individuals. It's not that exactly, but that was one of the things that was important to us because it's something that we spent a lot of time thinking about. And so I think one of the things that we value and recognize is that we can have a stronger studio, and it's not perfect, right, all the time. It's constantly like evolving. The always keep learning is because you can't be static. You have to continue to evolve. You have to change and recognize where your weaknesses are. But we can have a stronger studio if we're better stewards of our financial resources in the office in whatever ways we can do that to the best of our limited abilities. But we weren't always like that. So you learn those lessons the hard way sometimes. And obviously, we all know that our industry is very impacted by the economy in very direct and immediate ways. So we work really hard to try to just like pay attention to what's going on financially in the office and to try to manage our resources to the best of our ability. But every firm, it's ridiculous. Like, you have projects that go forever, that stop and start. You can't staff them. People don't always pay you when they're supposed to because that's happening. So it's really challenging. And I think probably somebody here has better ideas. Meejan must have better ideas about how to do that than I do. We're constantly working at it, it's not, and hopefully it's not what we're doing all the time, but if you're not doing it, you can't create the context for all the other work to happen. So it's important. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. So the office seems to be really multifaceted across a lot of various scales, and you seem to touch upon a lot of sort of research and innovational aspects through the design process and the community engagement part of it as well. So I guess my question is, how do you see that sort of evolving moving forward with the office, now reflecting back on the book and sort of your findings on it?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. We're still catching our breath a little bit, I have to say. Like, the book process was like a really big lift, and a lot of it, again, I said, was projecting forward, but we're kind of getting over it too, a little, I guess, emerging. So I do think one of the things I'd like to see more of in our work, and it kind of depends on the context, like, we really believe in those deeper and broader levels of community engagement. Not all our clients share that value, and depending on the context where you're working, the way that engagement can happen can be very controlled and constrained for reasons that are valid. Like, a university needs to handle engagement in a way differently maybe than a public project will handle it. So I think one of the places for us kind of relates to some of these other questions, like what I would love to see, and Adam and Steve, my partners, and I would love to see, is like continuing to do work that is important and meaningful to us and to the studio in places where it can be impactful, but to continue to bring clients into that process with us to kind of lead forward, right? So, and that happens in a few different ways. One of the ways is like the research piece that we talked about. One of the ways is environmental and sustainable. How can we bring our clients towards a place where they can make better choices about materials, about energy, about water, even if they're not having that conversation, which shockingly enough, a lot of clients do, but many clients, just as many, don't. So really, like, how can we bring them there because of our value set? And then similarly, how can we kind of help clients understand that they don't need to be afraid of the engagement part, because the engagement piece will enrich the project and really make it stronger and bring people, bring support to a project in a way that would otherwise not happen. So those are ambitions, but they really, not every project we have in the office are we able to achieve like all of those things, or maybe half of those things. So it's kind of a constant, constantly kind of advocating or pushing for it in a way that clients can understand and appreciate how it will make the project better and their investment better at the end of the day, like what they get at the end of the process, like more meaningful. So that's a place I think that we'll continue to work. But it takes some time. It takes some time.
I think we have just a little bit more time for maybe one or two more questions. Oh, Hamad's going for a second, maybe a third.
I think it's a third, but go for it.
He is a graduate. He's a graduate of our program, so.
Third and fourth, but so you've woven a very interesting, beautiful narrative. There's adaptive reuse in one project, there's preservation in another, there's mass timber in a third, and there's a story of practicing, creating a sustainable practice, which is practicing sustainably, which is what you were just talking about. And then there's also a subtext of sustainability in your practice. How strongly does sustainability feature from the get-go or coming into the project? Is it, are you often the driving force? Is it a client? Is it a meeting of halfway? And then stemming from that, just the second question, there's also a fairly clean split between high-end or higher-end corporate clients and very budget-constrained, community-centered projects, education projects. How does what you're taking from the high-end projects or the corporate projects translate into adding value to projects that can't afford the same things, and then vice versa?
Oh, I lost the first question, which was thinking about your second question. Sustainability. Thank you. So that's exactly the problem, right? It's both, like you said, a meeting in the middle, or both and. Certain clients have really high aspirations from sustainability could be so many different things, right? So that's there's many different ways to kind of embed sustainability in your work, in your practice, or in a project, but it may not be all things, depending on the place, the project, the budget, those constraints. So it's really both. Some clients have really high aspirations, and we're really excited in those contexts because we can kind of really do better work and work that we feel is more responsible, and know that there's an appetite for it, and there's a way to kind of invest in that process and the outcome. But then other times we're really leading the conversation. We're not perfect at it, and so one of the things we've been talking about I often will say that in our office we're very deliberative, and so stuff kind of happens at a glacial pace. But we are constantly trying to reflect and refine our processes, and so one of those spaces is really how we initiate more productive conversations around sustainability goals earlier on. How do we embed that talent and those skill sets in a team earlier on, even if a client isn't asking for it, so that we're able to kind of have a better conversation to set goals together that help us help the project perform better. So we're pushing those processes so that we can exercise the muscle on a more rapid and regular basis, whether a client is articulating those goals to us or not. Fortunately, in certain spaces, like in higher ed, we do a lot of higher ed work, those goals are really embedded. In public work, those goals are embedded, but in private work or some commercial work, they might be less so. So it kind of is about a combination of the two. Now I lost the second question. That's terrible.
How do things translate from, the two different sort of practice segments?
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm like counting your questions on my finger, but that doesn't help me. Like I need to write the word down. Like it doesn't mean anything that I wanted to. So it's that's like that has to do with like all the things happening, like everything everywhere all at once, right? Like all different kinds of things. And so sometimes it gets a really very, very literally, you know, you're making more profit on one project that underwrites a loss on another, like at its most simplest, the most basic way. Not every project, you know, I wish I were a better business person, but not every project covers the effort that you're putting into it. And so on one level, projects that have, you know, that's at its most basic level, how it happens is sort of through covering, you know, we put it on one pot and then we spread that, and that's what's sustaining the office. But there are other ways, like there could be access to resources. It could be connecting, you know, I mean, this doesn't happen all the time because it takes time and thought and energy and someone having the wherewithal to do it, but it could be connecting like a community member, first maybe a more public-facing, community-oriented project. Maybe we're connecting that community member to a supplier on a very different kind of project so that we can actually like channel material resources in a direction where they might not otherwise go. So there's other ways that sometimes that happens, but when it comes down to like the projects themselves, it could be expertise. It could be that we're applying certain skill sets or things we're able to achieve or do on one kind of project, and then we're taking that or that consultant approach and learning and being able to apply that to another project that might not otherwise have the opportunity to kind of have those same conversations or embed those same techniques. So I think it happens in myriad ways. I'm sure there are other ways to kind of think about it, but at its most fundamental, it's really about like, you know, spreading the fee to support the team, and it's not always like it's not always happening across the board in a very even way.
Since I'm holding the mic, I'm going to
Bob,
take the
go for
last
it.
question.
All right.
And it will not be a business question.
It's okay.
But since it is Climate Week and the UN is here,
Yes.
and everyone is in session, there are hundreds and hundreds of venues going on. I just wanted to quick footnote that Rising Currents is a document that we still use almost every day here, as well as Palisades Bay that you did at Princeton. Paul, I think you took a great initiative in that.
Yes.
We actually were just using it because we're looking a lot at the waterfront. But I wanted your thoughts on where we are today relative to climate. Obviously, your firm has spent a lot of time on that. You have a number of really signature waterfront projects.
Yeah.
Wanted to get your thoughts on maybe sharing that with the students, especially since many of them are embracing these issues and challenges.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Bob. Like where we are today, I mean, I think one of the things that's wonderful about kind of our community in the city and our community kind of architects and designers and engineers is that we're able to push policy and awareness to help lead choices in the right direction. And I think that I think across many different sectors, whether it's energy or water management or material usage or material health, bird safe glazing, you know, green roofs, like all of these things that, I mean, it seems like we're always trying to work around compliance and be creative relative to building codes. But the reality is that our advocacy as architects and designers is what helps push those codes, puts them into place, and actually makes owners, to get back to this question of how we lead a conversation in sustainability, helps force owners' hands to have to perform better. A lot of institutions will perform better because they'll say, we want to do 20% better than code. We want to do better than, or like, you know, LEED Silver doesn't count anymore. We want to do gold or platinum, right? Like whatever it is. But I think we have, you know, in the 15 or so years since Rising Currents, there's going to be like an anniversary program, I think, coming up at the Center for Architecture, to put a plug in for that. And that Barry is coordinating. there has been movement in that direction, which unfortunately is movement in that direction out of response to crisis, which is how we humans need to make choices, I guess, in our lives. So some of it is responding to unfortunate realities or unfortunate situations, and obviously there's significant work to be done. In terms of the water piece, obviously we see it right here, right? You look out in Wagner Park, you look on the East River, all of that kind of reimagining of the waterfront is like massive investment has happened to try to protect the city. And I think obviously change can be hard for communities, but I think those moves are really impactful and important, and we're seeing reinvestment in the edge, reinvestment in green space in ways that hopefully will make the city more resilient in the future. But there's a long ways to go also. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's.
This is thank you.